Hey. Hi. Happy Good Friday. So I was debating about, first things first. Just enough. That's good. Listen, I was debating about what I wanted to say for Good Friday. And I was looking up different things like different historical Roman historians like Tacitus, who is in like 116 AD. Really, Jesus died around 30 to 36 AD. Josephus from like 93 AD. These people are not in the Bible. They're non-Christian people that wrote about Jesus. And it's really very neat. So anyway, I was going to do that, right? So I was writing all my notes. You can see there's like 2 pages. And I got to, as I was looking up some of my stuff, I got to this article. And it's on this website called Marriage Track, so TRAC.com, a physician's view of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And I was like, because that was the next thing I wanted to know, so I wrote down 2 pages of all this stuff, and then I got to this page about a physician's view, right? He's a physician. And he wrote, I don't have my glasses, they're downstairs. And I started taking notes, and then as I was reading his stuff, I was like, I just put my notepad down, and I was like, I just have to read this. I'm going to go through some of the stuff he says, and there's going to be a point in here that I just start reading to you, because it's unbelievable. I mean, it's not unbelievable. It's just, you read the Bible about the accounts of Jesus's death, right? And it's like, and he said it so perfectly. He was like, they say, in the Bible, like in Luke, it says, and then Pilate delivered him to be scourged, or having him scourged, 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 which I'll tell you what that is, delivered him to be crucified, and they crucified him. And there's no, we have no real understanding of all of the things, so I'm reading through this, and he studied like crucifixion in history, the different types of things, and Jesus's would have been, in Roman historical culture, would have been a T shape, and how they put it up, and all the different things, right? And so he starts going through all that, and so I'm making notes, and then I just get down to a point where it's like, you just have to hear what this says. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things. First of all, when you see in paintings, they have the pictures of the holes in his hand. So the word for hand, where he says Jesus after he's raised from the dead, and he says, feel my hands, the term for that is wrist. They would not have put the nail here because your body weight can't hold it. They would have put the nail here in between the wrist, and it would have been between the small bones of the radial and the ulna. Okay, so this is where the nail would have gone. And the nails are driven through these parts right here, and because this can support the weight of the body, your palms can't. And then usually the victim's crime was stated on a plaque, which they call a titulus, and they would have written their crime on that. And so that's why on Jesus's titulus, they wrote Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And so that's what they would have put above the criminal. And so also before he was crucified, they talk in the Bible in Luke about how he was in so much agony that he was sweating drops of blood. And it's an actual medical condition, and it's called hematidrosis, which is where tiny tiny capillaries in the sweat glands break, and they mix with your sweat glands, and you can sweat blood, and it's called hematidrosis. It's an actual medical condition, and I've also read it's rare, but you see it in extreme agony or fear, not fear that Jesus was afraid, but like people going to their death, you know what I mean? When they're walking to their death, being executed and things like that. And so it's an actual medical condition. So that happened. So, okay, he was arrested in the middle of the night. Okay. And when he was arrested, he was brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. And this is where the first physical trauma happens for Jesus on this journey, is when he gets arrested in the middle of the night and taken to the Sanhedrin, right? And so what they do is they start smacking him in the face. They spit on him and they strike him in the face, bruising him and battering him. He spends the evening, the rest of the evening there, dehydrated, no sleep, probably very exhausted, and they take him in the early morning hours to Pontius Pilate, okay? So now nothing physical, no physical, like when he's actually in talking to Pontius Pilate, they don't beat him in there. He's had the first beatings and smackings and things overnight when he was arrested. Okay. So in response to the crowd yelling, "Crucify him, give us Barabbas," because Pilate wanted to wash his hands of the whole matter, he orders, and there's some speculation here, but some people say he ordered Jesus to be scourged, which I'll explain physically what that is, as his full penalty. And when the crowd was saying that's not enough, he's said he was God and he's done this is super bad and they're trying to defend Caesar or whatever. And so then he's like, okay, well, fine. So he gives them Barabbas and orders him to be crucified. So, but either way, Pilate orders him to be scourged or whatever. And this is what that is. All right, so preparations for the scourging were carried out when the prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. It is doubtful the Romans would have made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter, but the Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. The Roman legionnaires stepped forward with the flagrum or flagellum thingy in his hand, and it's a short whip, and it's consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the ends of each of them. And the heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus's back and his shoulders and his legs. Okay? As the first thongs cut through, now this is where I'm just going to read, because this is where he starts to give you an account of the crucifixion and explain as a physician what's actually happening to Jesus's body. So, as the thongs cut through the skin only, then as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissue, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and the veins of the skin. Now, this is going to get a little gory, but Jesus did this for you. So if you have tiny itty-bitty children, then maybe you explain this to them differently. But as adults, let's move on. So it subcutaneous tissue producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from the vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce large, deep bruises, which are broken open by subsequent blows. And finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn and bleeding tissue. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. The half-fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. The Roman soldiers see a great joke in this provincial Jew claiming to be king. they throw a robe across his shoulders and place a stick in his hand for a scepter. They still need a crown to make their travesty complete, and flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used in bundles for firewood, are plaited into a shape of a crown, and this is pressed into his scalp. Again, there's copious bleeding because the scalp being one of the most vascular areas of the body. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers take the stick from his hand and strike him across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. Finally, they tire of their sadistic sport, and the robe is torn from his back. Already, having adhered to the clots of blood and serum in the wounds, its removal causes excruciating pain, just as in the careless removal of a surgical bandage, and almost as though he were again being whipped, the wounds once more begin to bleed. In deference to Jewish custom, the Romans return his garments. The heavy patibulum, which is patibulum of, I don't know what that is. It's whatever. It's the cross, is tied across his shoulders, Jesus' shoulders. And the procession of the condemned Christ and the two thieves, and the execution detail of the Roman soldiers, headed by a centurion, begins its slow journey along the Via Dolorosa. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, is too much, and he stumbles and falls. The rough wood of the beam gouges into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulder. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, selects a stalwart North African onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Jesus follows, still bleeding and sweating the cold, clammy sweat of shock, until the 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, which has a mild analgesic effect, and it's basically to numb the pain, and Jesus refuses it. He doesn't want to numb any of the experience. And so Simon is ordered, that guy, to place the whatever of the patibulum of the cross on the ground. And Jesus is quickly thrown backwards with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of the wrist, and he drives a heavy, square, wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The patibulum of the cross, or whatever, is then lifted in place at the top of the stipes of the Titulus reading. So I'm assuming these are all pieces of the cross. I don't know them all. And Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is nailed in place at the top of the cross. That's what they're nailing in place. So now, the left foot is now pressed backwards against the right foot. And with both feet extended, toes down, a nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails in his wrist, excruciating pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode into the brain. The nails in the wrist are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there's a searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, as the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. So hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed and the intercostal muscles are unable to act. So air can be drawn into the lungs but cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in the life-giving oxygen. It is undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences that were recorded, 7 being the number of completion also, which is interesting. The first, looking down at the Roman soldiers throwing dice for his seamless garments, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The second, to the penitent thief, he says, "Thou shalt be with me in paradise." The third statement, looking down at the terrified, grief-stricken adolescent John, the beloved apostle, he said, "Behold thy mother." Oh my gosh. Can you believe that even just happened? Oh, okay. I will not be stopped. I don't even know what's happening right now. Listen, are you still there? I'm still here. Oh, listen. I won't be stopped. That was crazy. Did you see? It's all right. I'm not afraid. So let's move on. So he says, "Behold thy mother." Then looking to his mother Mary, he says, "Woman, behold thy son." The fourth cry is from the beginning of the 22nd Psalm. He says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Jesus experienced hours of limitless pain and cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent, partial asphyxiation. Oh my God. Sorry, Jesus. Asphyxiation, searing pain where tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony begins, a terrible crushing pain in the chest, as the pericardium slowly fills with serum and begins to compress the heart. One remembers again in the 22nd Psalm, the 14th verse, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels." It is now almost over. The loss of tissue fluids has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissue, and the tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissue sends their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus gasps in his fifth cry, "I thirst." One remembers another verse from the prophetic 22nd Psalm. "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaw, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death." So a sponge soaked with this cheap, like sour wine, it's like the staple of the Roman legionnaires, is lifted to his lips, and apparently he doesn't take any of the liquid. So the body of Jesus is now in extremes, and he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissue. This realization brings out his sixth words, possibly little more than a tortured whisper: "It is finished." His mission of atonement has completed, and finally he can allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nails, straightens his legs, and takes a deeper breath and utters his seventh and last cry, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." The rest you know. In order that the Sabbath not be profane, the Jews asked that the condemned men be dispatched and removed from the cross. So the common method of ending a crucifixion was by crucifixion or whatever, and they break the bones of the legs. And this prevented the victim from pushing upwards, pushing himself upwards. Thus, the tension could not be relieved from the muscles of the chest, and the rapid suffocation would occur. So the legs of the two thieves were broken. But when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that this was unnecessary. Apparently, to make undoubtedly sure of death, the legionnaire drove his lance through the fifth interspace between the ribs, upward into the pericardium, into the heart. And the 34th verse of the 19th chapter of the Gospel, according to St. John, reports, and immediately there came out blood and water. That is, there was an escape of water fluid from the sac surrounding the heart, giving post-mortem evidence that our Lord died, not the usual crucifixion, death by suffocation, but of heart failure, a broken heart, due to shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. Thus, we have had our glimpse into the medical evidence of that epitome of evil which man has exhibited towards man and towards God. It has been a terrible sight. This is his last little whatever. And more than enough to leave us despondent and depressed. How grateful we can be that we have the great sequel in the infinite mercy of God towards man, at once the miracle of the atonement, and then in parentheses it says, at one meant. That's good. And the exception of the triumphant Easter morning. That's what he wrote. I read this, and I was writing the little things, and I was taking notes about people who are non-Christian who wrote about Jesus, like factual evidence of the life of Jesus. And then I read that, and it was like, this day in history, when Jesus suffered that, it was not a triumphant day for the people who lived with him in that time. It was horrific. It wasn't just he was murdered in the most horrific manner possible. And as an actual man and actually God, there's no way, if he was the greatest con man on the face of the earth, that someone would die that way for a lie. It's impossible. He was either who he said he would be, or he was a liar. And there's no way that a liar is going to die that death for a lie. So he 100% is God. He is who he said he is. And this is how he died. Factually, literally, in history. But guess what the good news is? That on the third day, as written by non-Christian people in historical context, like Tacitus and Josephus, and a number of people who talked about Christ followers and Jesus having seen him rose from the dead and all that, right? He rose again on the third day, conquering death, so that he could pay that penalty for us, so we don't have to suffer that. So that when I die and God takes me home, to be apart from this body is to be present with the Lord. And I immediately go to see Jesus because I accept the gift that he gave to me when he died that way. Because I say, thank you. Come into my heart. Thank you for forgiving my sins. For not just believing that he was a man that died in history. That the demons believe and they shudder. That's not enough. You have to have faith in him and say, thank you. Thank you for forgiving my sins. Thank you for dying this horrific way for me, that my soul can be saved. Listen, I'm going to leave you with one last thing. Okay. Imagine that your life, your soul, is a rope. I heard this before. I said it before, and I've said it before. I'm going to say it again because it's a really good analogy. Imagine that your soul is a rope that goes on for eternity. Just goes on into space, goes forever and ever and ever. Amen. Francis Chan said this example, and I love the example. And then imagine that this portion of the rope is your life here on this earth. And the rest is your time in eternity. And from the foundations of the earth, God knew we were going to fall, we were going to sin, we were going to fail. He knew it. And he knew from the foundations of the earth that he had a plan and a resolution for that, and it was going to cost his son. But it would pay the price for the rest of your eternity. Do you understand? We're not guaranteed tomorrow. This body is eventually dying. But at some point when your body is gone, where does your soul go? If Jesus was who he said he was, and he is, if he suffered that way, if the apostles, look up how they died. Do you believe that they would go to their grave having been beaten, stoned, murdered, crucified upside down, beheaded, their livelihoods taken, everything from them to the grave, that they saw Jesus, that they saw him raised from the dead, that they touched his wounds? They didn't see a ghost or an apparition, and people wrote about it, non-Christian people. Like, do you believe they would have gone to that end historically, right? This is accurate. This is not like I'm telling you just facts, right? Do you think they would have died that way for a con man, for a lie? They didn't. And guess what? That evidence requires a verdict. It's a book. It's called Evidence That Requires Verdict. But that evidence of the factual life and death and horrific manner that Jesus went through, it requires a verdict. And guess what? You don't have to decide today, and you don't have to ever decide. But can I tell you, that's a decision. Because when you die, it's too late to make a decision. You will have already decided to reject him. If you have a son, a baby, and in our sinful nature, right, your son sacrifices himself to save somebody else. If they reject and spit on and mock your son's sacrifice, how do you feel about them? So listen, if I'm wrong about Jesus, which I am not, but let's just pretend. If I'm wrong about Jesus, I've lived a really good life, you know? And who knows what the afterlife would be if I'm not right, which I am right. But if I'm right, and I am, then, you know? Because if you reject Jesus and you don't believe him and you don't accept the sacrifice for you, you better be right. You better be right. Because either way, I'm good. If I'm wrong, I'm good. If I'm right, I'm good. But like, if you don't believe in the Lord, like you better be right. Like, you better be right. Here's the thing. You're not right, though. I just want you to know the Lord. Just want you to know Jesus. You understand? He gives you a peace that passes understanding, not as the world gives, but as he gives, that you might not be afraid. Right? Anyway, this weekend, I hope you have a wonderful Easter with your family. I hope that you take time to thank the Lord for what I just read to you, the horrific manner that Jesus died for us, and that you will, if you don't know him, that you'll accept Jesus into your heart and start an amazing journey. You know, it's not a perfect journey. There's suffering involved, but guess what? There's suffering involved without Jesus. I can't imagine how people live their lives without the Lord because of the suffering in this world. I thank the Lord that I have Jesus. I don't know how people endure their life without him. I don't know. So anyways, I love you so much, like a crazy person. I hope you have a great weekend. Pray for you. Please pray for me. Be good to one another. Don't forget that you're one another's. Don't forget to be good to yourself. I love you, and I mean it, Peanut. Mwah.